The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series, and wherever you are in Queensland, we've got a very good audience here for the Peak Services Lunch and Learn series. So I just want to make sure that I'm being heard. That's the very first thing that we need to do. So if you're unfamiliar with this, if you look on the right-hand side, you'll notice there's a question box. And if you could just open that question box, and if I could ask you just to type in the word clear, that will let me know that I'm coming across loud and clear. That's the very first thing. So could I ask you just to type in the word clear in the question box, and then we can get started. Okay, thanks John. Thanks Kaylin. Thanks Mark. Thanks Marsha. Okay, it sounds like I am coming across loud and clear, which is great. So that's the very first thing we need to sort out. Now, the Lunch and Learn series, as you'd be aware, is 6 one-hour modules. Now, obviously, this is the first of 6. These are scheduled every fortnight. So what happens is after this, I send you out an email. It won't be today, by the way. It'll be over the weekend. But you'll receive an email, and that email will have a copy of the slides for today's presentation and also a copy of the video. So if you want to go back and have a look at the slides or even watch the video, that's fine. So if at any stage you're not available for one of the Lunch and Learn series, you'll receive a copy of the recording and the slides as well, which of course is great. Now, so the important thing for you is when you get your email to make sure that you register for all 6 sessions. The reason for that is that if you're registered, then you'll get the automatic updates. Okay, now if you're not registered, what will happen is you'll fall out of the loop and you'll miss out. So at the end of this presentation, or at least when you get your email from me, what I'd suggest you do is you basically go in and make sure you register for all the remaining 5 sessions. That would be great. Unfortunately, you can't do it for one and then the rest follows because for all intents and purposes, it's 6 separate presentations. Okay, so that's a little bit of the logistics out of the way. Now, the other logistic is that if you've got questions in relation to anything that I go through today or any of the other sessions, please use the question box where you typed in the word clear, and you just type in your question. So type in your question throughout the broadcast at any stage. In fact, the best time to do that is as soon as you think about it. That way I'll respond to it. I'll see it straight away. No one else gets to see it except me. And the good news is that when I see it, I'll respond to it. And that way we don't have this sort of 10 minutes of awkward silence at the end while people are waiting, or I'm waiting at least, for people to type in their questions. So type them in as we go, and I'd encourage you to do that. You can make comment, you can make a question, you can ask a question, you can make a comment, anything at all, or you can seek clarification as well. So that's another important part of the process. And I guess the third important element is that at the end of each session, what I'm going to do is provide you with some homework. Now, it's not theoretical homework, it's really just homework where you are required to go out and try some things with your team. And so it's a very practical program in that sense. So obviously today's about feedback. You could probably imagine that your homework is going to be around giving some feedback to some of your team members. And then when we come back in 2 weeks' time, I'll just quickly review what we covered, and people can make any comment or any observations from that point on. You're welcome to send me emails during sessions and let me know your progress or frustrations or whatever. That's all part of the exercise as well. There's 2 diagnostics in the process. So the first diagnostic will be next time we meet in a fortnight, and I'll be sending you out a link for that. basically when I send you out this email over the weekend. All right, so that's pretty much it. Do you have any questions? Does anyone have any questions at this point before we launch into today's topic and the Lunch and Learn series in general? Okay, I'll keep an eye on that if there is any questions that people might have. Okay, now what you're seeing in front of you now on the screen is the actual topics. Now you would be aware of these, I'm sure, but the topics are there, and obviously we're covering Unit 1 today. And then when we come back together again in a fortnight, we'll be looking at Unit 2, which is enhancing your personal influence. And as I mentioned earlier, you'll have a diagnostic that you'll need to complete for that. So Unit 2 very much is a briefing, or should I say a debriefing, around your influencing capabilities profile, and basically how you like to influence people, because we're all in the business of influence, aren't we? And then in Unit 3, we're going to look at how we can optimize team performance. So most of you would have a team. It might be a small team, it might be a large team. I think it varies very much in the cohort that we've got in this Lunch and Learn series. But whatever the size of the team, obviously getting the best out of the team is critically important to your success and of course their success as well. In Unit 4, we're looking at an important and often frustrating topic about getting the very best from the people that you lead. And that's not as easy as it sounds. I'm sure you'd be aware if you've had any experience as a leader or supervisor. But ultimately, our job is to do what we can to get the very best out of the people we lead. In Unit 5 will be your second diagnostic, and I'll be sending that out, and that'll be a sort of a paper and pencil version, if you like. So you'll receive that well through the program. And so Unit 5, understanding people and their personality, is really a process of looking at understanding how people like to operate. So we'll have a bit of fun with this topic. But at the end of the day, whenever any of us have a personality clash, it's often a result of the fact that we both look at things differently. In other words, we both have different personalities. And of course, things don't gel. So understanding personality types is critically important to your success as a leader. And then the final unit will be facilitating effective meetings. And you might think, well, why have I included that in there? Well, let's face it, in local government, it's one meeting after the other, isn't it? You could argue that you're in a meeting now with me, and then when you finish this, you'll be into another meeting, and then another meeting, and it just goes on and on forever. But of course, you may be chairing some of those meetings, and if you're not chairing those meetings, you will at some point during your career. And getting good at facilitating team meetings, I think, is a critically important skill. Reason being is, let's face it, the majority of meetings we attend are dead, dull and boring, and frankly are not terribly efficient. At the same time, they cost significant amounts of dollars to run when you consider the costs associated with having everybody in the room at the same time and the opportunity costs that are lost when they're not doing something else. So that's the last topic we cover, and that'll be the end of the Lunch and Learn series. So folks, strap in. You don't need to take a lot of notes. You just need to sit back and enjoy. But as I said before, I like to make this participatory, so you have an opportunity at any stage to ask me any question or make any comment or observation at any time using the question box there on the right-hand side. Okay, so let's launch into today's topic. Now, today's topic is very much around feedback, and you might say, well, why am I covering the topic of feedback? Well, it is true to say that, and research has demonstrated this, that Australian managers are pretty much the world's worst at giving feedback. Now, there's a lot of theories as to why that is, but the reality is, as managers, we're not particularly good at it. In other words, we don't give enough feedback. And so I want to talk about that today as a starting topic. And as I said earlier, there'll be some homework around giving people feedback as a result of the end of this. At the end of this, so let's think about the topic of feedback. So this is a quote from John Allen, who says that if performance reviews are the only time when feedback is given, that's a problem, because it's certainly better than nothing. I think what a lot of managers and supervisors and team leaders and coordinators do is they wait until performance review time, which is normally once a year or at the most twice a year, and then decide to give people feedback, when in actual fact it may have happened, whatever the incident was, whether it was positive or negative, it may have happened 3 or 4 months ago. So it loses its impact because the person on the receiving end of the feedback is thinking to themselves, if this was so significant, you would have given me this feedback earlier when it happened. So it loses its impact. But I think that's one of the problems with performance reviews, is that we tend to save up our feedback for that moment. So don't save it up. The key I want you to get into is giving regular feedback, day by day, project by project, month by month, incident by incident, and just continually get used to being in that feedback loop with your people. Now, there's some fairly sobering statistics here that you might want to consider before we move into some of the do's and don'ts in relation to giving feedback. So 60% of employees don't understand their organisational goals. I think that's very true. I don't mean that they can parrot them off. They just don't get what the goals are. And I think in my experience in local government, that's very true. 87% of employees aren't engaged in their work, and 20% actively undermine the value of their peers, that their peers create. So significant number of people are what we would say are disengaged at work. I've seen other surveys saying 70% of people are disengaged in work. Now, it's their choice about whether they are engaged. So it's not something that you can wave a wand and someone all of a sudden becomes engaged. But the reality is there are certain things that you can do to create the right environment for engagement to take place. The choice will be up to the individual whether or not they take up that opportunity. But there are certain things that we can do and not do which can impact on the environment of engagement. 77% of employees say their performance would improve with more feedback. Giving feedback increases engagement by 60%. So this is what surveys are saying that employees indicate are critically important. So if you think about it, the whole reason that we've got local bylaws, we've got rules and regulations, we've got legislation and policy, why have we got all these things? And the bottom line is that people, human beings, actually need feedback. They actually want to know where the line in the sand is, and they want to know where they stand in relation to that line in the sand. Now, obviously, if somebody doesn't meet an expectation or breaks a law or does something that's contrary to the expectation, and somebody gives them feedback, they may not appreciate the feedback. But the important point to understand is they need it. They need it. There's a fundamental need for human beings to need feedback. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a regulated society that we live in. And you can see that people are saying that with more feedback, I'd be more engaged. And 50% of managers fail to hold team members accountable and have the hard conversation. So I'm hoping that the Lunch and Learn might encourage you, if you don't already do this, is to have those difficult, challenging conversations with people. Because at the end of the day, people expect you to do that. Doesn't mean they necessarily like it. Sure, there's a skill set involved, but avoiding them actually doesn't make those situations go away. Have you noticed that? They won't disappear magically by you ignoring them. So you actually have to confront them if and when they arise. And finally, 57% of employees say that they want the critical feedback that helps them improve. So the majority of employees are actually saying, I want more feedback from my boss so that I know how I can improve. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, when I start getting some feedback from my boss here in council, I'll start giving feedback to others. But I wouldn't wait. I would get in and do that now. And it's unfortunate if you're not receiving enough feedback from your manager, but I don't think that's an excuse for you not to do what should be done with your people. So you can see there's some sobering statistics there and some real issues around communication and feedback. And I believe that if you can get into the habit of having more feedback, and remember, feedback's not always negative. There's positive feedback as well, and I suspect we should be giving more positive feedback. I'm not suggesting we should only give positive feedback, but we should be giving positive feedback, and of course, when the situation arises, constructive feedback that might be critical as well. Okay, now this graph is interesting, and it kind of sums up what I was talking about on the previous slide. And I want to make the point here that if you look at the blue in the bar there, the blue is engaged and the red is disengaged. So if we start at the top and we look at a situation where people only receive positive feedback, or what we might call strength-based feedback. So if people only receive positive feedback, then it's pretty likely that you will have an engaged team. Now that's great. So it basically means that we should be giving more positive feedback. So when was the last time you gave someone some positive feedback? And of course, it's not too late. When we finish here at 1:30 this afternoon, you can go out and start giving positive feedback. So obviously positive feedback engages people, but what about the next bar? If people only receive critical feedback, so they don't get any positive feedback at all, but they do get negative feedback, so you pull people up because the standard wasn't reached, or the report wasn't written correctly, or people didn't turn up on time to the meeting, whatever it might be, which is negative, the argument is that people will still have a high degree of engagement with negative feedback only. Now, what may surprise you, and it really is the point of this, is the last bar, which says if people don't receive any feedback, whether it's positive or negative, then they're likely to be disengaged. So in other words, if you want to create an environment where people choose to be disengaged, the very best way to do that is to give no feedback at all, positive or negative. So in other words, we really need to be giving people regular, consistent feedback, both positive and negative, when it's required. So I think, I just wanted to set this up before we moved any further to say that it's a critically important part of your job. Is it easy? Well, not always, but there are some skills and some things that you can do to make it easier, and clearly what I'm going to be going through in this broadcast is some things that you should consider when you're giving feedback. All right, let's move on. So if you've got any questions, comments, observations, go for your life. Now's the time to type them in. So let's have a look now at a little bit more information in relation to feedback. Roughly by a 3-to-1 margin, employees believe that constructive feedback does more to improve their performance than positive feedback. So people are actually wanting or needing, as I mentioned earlier, what we might call constructive feedback or negative feedback. They want it and they need it. And as I said earlier, it's a fundamental human need to know where you stand and to know what's required of you. Now, the secret of having employees listen to your feedback is whether or not they respect you. So if I get feedback from somebody I don't respect, no matter how well delivered it is, no matter how relevant it is, no matter how timely it is, no matter how tactfully it's delivered, I'm likely not to follow through. Why? Because I don't respect that person. So respect is earned, incredibly hard to get, and requires authenticity. So at the end of the day, you and I are in this job of gaining respect from people, not being liked. Now, I know some of you in smaller councils throughout Queensland socialise with your team members. You're very familiar with them. The lines between work and home are blurred, and of course it becomes quite difficult for you in those sort of circumstances to be giving feedback. But here's a little tip for you. I would strongly recommend that when you give feedback to somebody that you might be socially, you might be friends with, then actually preface it by saying, I really wanted to talk to you now as your supervisor, or I wanted to talk to you as your coordinator. So in other words, set the scene. So in other words, you're wearing your leadership hat now, not your friend hat. So that's a way of being able to demarcate between, being a friend with someone and actually being their boss. So respect is critically important, and what that means is this: that you could have this exact same thing said to two different people with completely different effects. So you give somebody some constructive feedback and they may go ahead and do something differently as a result of it. But the other person who'd received exactly the same feedback may not. Now, why is that? Well, there's a number of possibilities, of course. But one of those reasons, perhaps, is that one person respects you and the other one doesn't. So the name of the game is to get respect. And I believe if you apply a lot of the skills and the thoughts and concepts that I'm going through in the Lunch and Learn, you'll find that you will gain more respect from the people that you lead. Okay, so respect is critically important as to whether or not people will accept what you say. Now, one of the key things for a leader when you're giving feedback is that you need to manage your expectations. So it's very, very important. If I, for example, walked up to any of your team members, I could do that now, and I asked them what your expectations were of them, would you be confident that they could tell me accurately and succinctly what it is that you expected of them? Would you be confident about that? You should be confident about that, because at the end of the day, people must be crystal clear about what you expect of them. Now, it's not a simple process, because there are 7 questions that you need to be able to answer in the positive to be able to ensure that you're managing expectations. And what I want to do is go through those 7 with you now. Let's start. Let's begin. Question number 1. Question number 1 is, what are your expectations as a leader? Are you crystal clear where the crossbar is, or the line in the sand? Are you absolutely clear about what your expectations are of other people? Now, this is very important. Now, you may say, well, I'm very clear. Well, have a think about it. In every situation, are you clear about people's expectations in terms of turning up to meetings on time? Are you clear about expectations around reporting? Are you clear about expectations around emails? Are you clear about expectations around the tasks that need to be done in order to get the job done? Do you have a very clear notion of what your expectations are? Now, that's probably the easiest of the 7 questions, because I suspect that many of you are pretty clear about what your expectations are. So that's one thing to be clear about it, but of course people aren't mind readers. They need, of course, to understand what it is or what your expectations are. So the second key question in managing expectations is, have you communicated those expectations to your team? Now, you might say to me, oh yes, I have done that. But remember, one of the key things with communicating expectations with people is that you need to be consistent and persistent. Consistent means that you have the same expectations, you don't change your expectations, they are consistent, but you're also persistent, and that's the one that people often forget. We need to be persistent, as in we never ever miss an opportunity where we should be giving people expectation, explaining to people expectations. Now, you can do that in a team environment, of course, but you can also do that one-on-one. And the most powerful place to communicate expectations is actually one-on-one, because the person's in front of you, and because they're in front of you, they pretty much are totally accountable, and so therefore it's easy to do that. So it's one thing knowing what your expectations which is question one. It's another thing to have communicated them. So think about whether you've done that. Again, if I went and talked to any of your people and asked them what your expectations were of them, would you be pleasantly surprised by what they said? In other words, would they be crystal clear? That would be very much a result of how clear you are and how persistent you are in terms of communicating your expectations. So question 3, it's one thing to have those expectations communicated. It's another thing to be clear, to understand what they mean. All right? So, you can explain your expectations, but do they actually understand what they mean? Now, that's very difficult to work out, because people often will not say to you, I'm confused, I don't understand what your expectations are. Could you explain that to me? They don't normally do that. What happens is they just go along, and you assume, of course, that they've got it, and then, of course, you find out later they don't, because they haven't met a certain expectation of yours. So it's one thing to know what they are. It's another thing to have communicated what they are. It's also another thing to understand, for them to understand what those expectations are. So any no's in any of these 7 questions would probably explain why you may have a challenge in managing your own expectations with the people that you lead. So question 4. Question 4 is, do my team members accept my expectations? So it's one thing to have communicated it. It's another thing to have actually understood it. The next question is, do they accept your expectations? Do they think they're realistic? Do they think they're achievable? Do they think they have the skills to meet those expectations? All right. So obviously, if somebody doesn't accept your expectations, even if they're clear about them, they're not likely to follow through, because they don't think it's reasonable. I've seen this a lot in the private sector, where often sales managers will set a very, very high sales goal or sales target for their team. So their expectation might be to double the revenue for last year. And the salespeople, when they're briefed on those expectations, nod dutifully, but in the back of their head, they think to themselves, there's no way in the world that I can accept that, because it's way, way too high. The bar is set too high. So accepting expectations is also important. So, question 5. Now, question 5 is, are my team members committed to meeting those expectations? So they might accept them, but it's another thing to commit to them. Now, I'm not splitting hairs here. They're 2 different things. I might accept an expectation or a goal as reasonable, but then I may not be committed to meeting it. Now, there might be a range of reasons why I'm not committed. I might be lazy. I don't respect you. I have other priorities that I enjoy doing more than the one that you're setting me. There's a whole host of reasons why people won't commit to meeting expectations. Now, one of the key questions that I think you should ask your team members is, when you've explained an expectation to somebody, and once they have understood what it means, and once they have accepted it as reasonable, what you could do is ask them, can I get your commitment? Can I get your commitment to finish this report by the close of business tomorrow? Actually eyeball them and ask them for their commitment. Now, if you ask people for their commitment, normally what will happen is you'll get a nod, or a grunt or even a yes, and that's a good thing. That's what you want. But that's great, because what you've done is you've drawn out a commitment from the other person, and it's highly likely that they'll be more likely to complete that expectation because you have asked them for their commitment and they've responded affirmatively to that commitment. So it's a way of actually getting people committed, but I very rarely see this in local government, where a leader, a coordinator, or a team leader or a manager will actually ask people for their commitment. Now, it's not unreasonable for you to ask for that the commitment to that expectation. So just look them in the eye and say, can I get your commitment that you'll get this done on time, if it's a time commitment. Now, so try that out. It works really well. Question 6. Now, question 6 is, do my team members know how they're performing against those expectations? Now, this is, of course, about feedback. This is the question around, are people aware of whether they are meeting your expectations? Now, the only way they can be aware of that, unless it's a very obvious expectation, the only way they can be aware of that is if you're giving regular feedback to them. And once they're aware of whether they're meeting that expectation or not, they can modify their behaviour if they're not, or it can reinforce the positive behaviour if they are. So this is where you need to give people clarity around where they stand in relation to those expectations. This is about commitment. All right. So the final question here for you is this: am I supporting my team members to achieve those expectations? Now, what I mean by that is that there are often roadblocks in organisations. There are often barriers and impediments. There are things that will get in the way of people meeting expectations. For example, a person can have 3 different priorities that they need to meet. And one of those priorities is an expectation that you have. They're put in the dilemma that they have these 2 other priorities that are critically important, and then they've got your priority. So your job, of course, is to pave the way to make it easier for people to meet those expectations. And the way to do that, of course, wherever possible, is to try, where you can, of course, is to remove the barriers. So, in other words, you might help them work out which is the most important priority. Or you might go and talk to another manager or colleague in another department and explain to them that, there are certain things that you require done before they get around to doing their job or their task, whatever it might be. So you can see it's an enormously complex challenge, isn't it, to manage expectations. So the questions are you clear about your expectations? Have you communicated them to your people? Do they understand them? Are they committed to them? Do they accept them, first of all? And do they commit to achieving them? And do they know how they're achieving? And have you done all you can to help them to meet those expectations? That's the essence of it. So it's a little framework for you to have a think about when you're working with your teams. All right, do we have any questions, any comments from anyone who'd like to respond to any of those questions? Okay. Well, if we do, I'll notice it. So normally people are a little bit quiet at the beginning of the Lunch and Learn series, and they warm up as we move in. Anyway, now here are some key things that you need to consider when you're giving feedback. Now, one of the things that's critically important, these aren't necessarily in any order, but there's some really important points around giving feedback that I think you'll find useful. The first thing is timing. It is critically important that you give the feedback as close to the event or the critical incident as possible. So if something goes wrong, in other words, people don't meet your expectation, the feedback should happen as soon after that event as possible. Equally, if somebody does something quite positive, then the moment they've done that, or as quickly after as you possibly can, would be to give them that feedback then. Now, why is this important? Well, the longer you leave the feedback, the less likely it is that the person receiving it will think it's very relevant. So, for example, if you were sitting in a performance review and you were giving someone feedback, and if you said to somebody in that performance review, I forgot to mention, or I didn't mention to you 3 months ago, or I didn't get around to mentioning this to you 3 months ago, but I just want to let you know that presentation you gave the management team was first class. Now, you've given feedback. What's the problem? Well, the person on the receiving end of that, who's probably quite happy that they've heard that from you, is probably thinking to themselves, if it was that good, surely you would have given me that feedback at the time. So it loses its impact as time moves on. So you really need to down tools and find an opportunity to give people feedback as soon as possible after the event. Not wait, but as soon as possible. Now, it may not be practical that you can do it immediately because you've got your head buried in something else, but as soon as possible. That might mean the next day, but I wouldn't be leaving it for days or weeks or months and leaving it and saving it for performance review, because what will happen is you might as well not give the feedback because it'll fall on deaf ears. So timing is critically important to do it at the right time, so timing is everything in terms of feedback. So obviously, if you think about this, if somebody's done something positive or negative and requires you to give them feedback, and you deal with it right there immediately after the event, then they in their own mind will be thinking to themselves, gosh, this is obviously very important to my boss, because he or she has taken the time immediately after the event to tell me about it. So timing's critical. So the more effective the feedback, the better the timing. Now, the other thing that's important in feedback is be specific. In other words, don't generalize about feedback. Be very specific about the feedback you're going to give, and have a think about how you might express it, particularly if it's negative feedback. So it's no good saying to someone, for example, I wish you could improve your rotten attitude. I mean, if you said that to somebody, which is feedback, it's not terribly specific, and they're probably not going to receive it in the right way because you're attacking them as a person. So it's very important to think carefully about what specifically it is that you're trying to give feedback on. Let me give you an example. Okay. Make your feedback specific. So, for example, if you said to somebody, overall, good job on the presentation at the morning's meeting, but it could have been better. Okay, that's feedback. What's wrong with it? Well, it's too vague. So what was wrong with the presentation? Because you mentioned there was something that could have been done better, but I don't know what it is. I don't necessarily know what it is. And just because they didn't like it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. So how could it have been better? That's the thought that goes in the person on the receiving end, goes in, and that's what they're thinking about. So wouldn't it be better to say something like this? So if you said to that person, same situation that they're in, and you said, great job on the presentation, I really like the way you use statistics to back up your key points. Okay, I'm being very specific. This is what I liked about it. One small comment, maybe for next time it would be better if you invited more comments from the group and got them more involved. Now that is good feedback because it's specific. And of course, if it's done straight after the meeting and the presentation, you've also met the timing criteria as well. Okay, so be very specific about the feedback that you're giving. Now, the other important element of feedback is that you need to be doing giving feedback frequently, it's not just some event that occurs once in a blue moon, such as a performance review. Feedback should happen, as I said earlier, moment by moment, situation by situation, incident by incident. Feedback should happen daily, weekly, monthly. It should be happening all the time. And you should be getting used to giving regular feedback every single day. That's your job as a leader. So find the opportunity to actually pull the person aside and give them that feedback. And again, it's both positive and negative, so depending on, of course, what it is. So being frequent about it. The very best leaders that I know are leaders who are giving regular, timely, specific feedback. And by doing that, of course, people are likely to respect that leader. And of course, the next time they give feedback, they're likely to take on board what it is that they need to do differently. Now, the other thing about feedback, it's not necessarily about you having a gift to the gab or being clever with words or whatever. One of the key things that I strongly recommend that you do is you should, during feedback, ask lots of questions. My view is that leaders are in the business of asking questions, not answering questions. Okay, have a think about that. I'll just repeat that. Leaders are in the business of asking questions, not answering questions. So, for example, before you start giving someone feedback about a project that they've completed for you, how about you start with the question, how did you think you went? Very simple question. Open up a dialogue, get them to comment. And then you might ask two more specific questions. You might say, what did you think you did well in? Or what went well? And then, of course, another question might be, what would you do differently next time? So if you actually use questions, you're engaging the other person in the feedback, and that becomes even more effective. All right, so it's not just about you parroting off some information. You need to connect with the person via conversation or dialogue by asking a range of questions. If they're just on the receiving end of you passively giving feedback, so in other words, they're not concentrating too much. They're just, you're doing all the talking and they're just doing the listening. It's probably not going to go very well for you. Okay. So get used to asking lots of questions. Now, the other thing I'd say with feedback is please do it in private. Now, a lot of people say, there's this little popular saying that we should praise in public and criticize in private. My personal view about this is that we should do both in private. Some people are actually quite uncomfortable and can be embarrassed when attention, albeit favorable, is drawn to them. So if you had a morning tea, for example, and you gave someone some positive feedback, well, it's not a bad thing, but some people, of course, don't actually like that. So I think play it safe and give people feedback in private. So find a meeting room, and if you've got an office, of course, close your door. Whatever works for you. If you're working in the outdoors area of council, then, go away somewhere private and have that conversation with people. So do it in private. And the reason for that is very simple. It is that we are actually respecting the other person. And we're doing that because we're respecting their need for privacy. And of course, the other possible reason is if it goes off the rails, you won't be making a fool of yourself either. There'll only be one person that would know that, and that'll be the other person. So do this in private. All right. So just coming back to it again, summing up, you need to be giving the feedback immediately after the event. You need to be asking lots of questions of the person that you're giving the feedback to in order to engage them in the feedback process. You need to be giving regular feedback, moment by moment, situation by situation. You need to be very specific about the feedback that you're giving, okay? And then you also, of course, need to be doing it in private. Now, the very best opportunities to be giving feedback are what we call critical incidents. Now, you might say, what's a critical incident? It sounds like something in the military. Look, a critical incident is any situation that's occurred in the workplace that you have observed or heard about. That's an opportunity for you to give feedback at that stage. So if you've seen that somebody's report is substandard, or you've seen that somebody's missed a deadline, or you've seen that someone hasn't handled an interpersonal conflict situation very well, whatever it might be, they're all critical incidents. And then you can use those critical incidents to leverage off. So in other words, by using a critical incident, you're actually being very practical in your feedback. And so the person actually can, in their own mind as well, refer back to what that situation was that you're giving feedback on. So use critical incidents can become very, very important. Now, the other thing about feedback is to concentrate on the future. Now, sometimes when we get into feedback, particularly negative feedback, what happens is the other person's starting to make excuses, or, this happened and that happened, and if that hadn't happened, I would have done this. All may be relevant, but at the end of the day, the only reason that you and I are giving feedback is so that we can either change future behaviour or reinforce past behaviour. There's no other reason for it. In other words, the past's gone, and all you can do by giving feedback, and all you should do by giving feedback, if it's negative feedback, then it's about people rectifying their behaviour for future. Now, if it's positive feedback, it's actually reinforcing the need to continue that behaviour for the future. All right, so you've got this, so no point in carrying on about the past other than to learn from it. At the end of the day, you want to move on. So have a think about that as well. So it's all about the future, not the past. Now, I want to talk about some things around sometimes when we have these difficult conversations with people. They're not easy to do, I understand that. So let me give you a few tips on that. So let's say you've really fed up and you've decided you've got to sit down with someone and you've really got to talk to them about their performance. You've been avoiding it for a long period of time, and the reason you've avoided it is because you kind of anticipate how they're going to react. So here are some things that you might like to consider. The very first thing you should consider is that you should be avoiding argument. When you're giving any sort of feedback about performance, this is not an opportunity to have an argument. Now, the other person might see it as an opportunity to have an argument, and that's their choice, but at the end of the day, you are not to argue with them. So, for example, what do? Well, there's two things that you can do. You can actually say to the other person, I refuse to argue with you about this. Now, when you say that, you've actually got all the cards. You're holding all the aces. By you saying to someone, I refuse to argue with you about it, you're basically saying that I'm in control. Now, the other thing you could do is you could actually say to somebody, let's agree to disagree. So on a relatively minor issue, you can actually say to the other person, let's agree to disagree on that. Because, you don't want to get bogged down in that detail, and frankly, they have a view and you have a view. It's not completely relevant to the overall expectation that you have of the other person. A second thing that you need to do when it comes to giving feedback in those very difficult, stressful, challenging conversations is focus on the person's performance. You're not actually attacking the person, or shouldn't be. You're attacking the behaviour. It's normally a behavioural issue. So what that means is that you need to separate the person from the behaviour. So it's not the person that's the problem, it's the way they're behaving that's the problem, or in that case, the way they're behaving in that situation is the problem. So try and separate that. That's why I say, if you're being too general with your feedback, people might take it as a personal attack. So for example, if you say you're always late, then you're attacking the person. It might seem like they're always late, but it's much better to be more specific and say the last 3 meetings we had, you arrived late is better, because that's talking about the behaviour, not the person. All right, so that's important. Another thing you need to do, as I said earlier, is focus on the future. Please do not get bogged down in the the whys and wheres and all the nitty-gritty around the excuse making that the other person may be involved in. Say, look, I'm not interested, let's put that aside, we can't do anything about it now anyway, and let's just focus on what we need to do for the future. That'd be the way I'd approach it. Okay, so there's 3 key things. Now, the other thing that you can do in these difficult conversations is try and emphasize a strength as well. Now, the very fact that you're sitting down with someone, having a performance conversation with them, as difficult as may be, clearly you must think in the back of your mind that this will not be a waste of time, because why would you bother doing it anyway? So you must believe that that person will do something about it, or is capable of doing something about it. In other words, you wouldn't do it otherwise, would you? So the least positive thing that can come out of one of these conversations is the fact that you believe that they're very capable of making the necessary changes next time round. So you can say that, but there might be other things as well. But I mean, this is not an excuse to sugarcoat the feedback. People still need to hear the negative feedback, doing it tactfully and using all the skills I mentioned, but this is not a case of you watering it all down so that they actually forget what the negativity was in the feedback. But by all means, it's important to actually emphasize the strong suits, the strong points that that person has as well. And finally, seek out the causes. Now, the reality is that you and I make assumptions about things. What is important for you is to check your sources and facts. So ask a lot of questions, particularly in a more complex environment, difficult situation. Ask the person to explain, what went wrong, or why did that happen, or who was involved, or when did it take place, or which particular project are you referring to. Get to find out what it is, and that's very, very important. So seek out the causes, because until you know what the causes are, you can't do much about it. Okay, so there's some tips. A couple of other things before we wrap up. When you're having a difficult conversation with someone, it's really, really important for you to get straight to the point. This is not an opportunity for small talk and idle chit-chat. So, for example, if you've booked a room, and you're moving towards that room with the other person, there's obviously a high state of anxiety, particularly with the other person, because they're probably not sure what all this is about. So by having a little bit of friendly chit-chat on the way to the meeting room is not actually going to help in this situation. So be very businesslike and get straight to the point, okay? And equally, at the end of it, finish it and then move away. Don't start talking about social things or other things to try and, smooth the waters, if you like. Now, once you get into the room, remember doing it in private, you need to explain the purpose of the meeting. Explain to the person why you're having this meeting and be straight to the point. Now, I find it's very helpful to write down the first words to come out of your mouth. I know that might seem a bit strange, but start to plan and think, how can I say this? Because remember, the first words in this conversation are critically important. And if you mess that up, then it's likely to go downhill from there on in, and that's not what you want. So write down exactly word for word. It only is 1 or 2 sentences, but get to the point and explain the purpose of the meeting. Now, once you've explained your particular expectations to the other person, bite your tongue until it bleeds, which is the next point. Bite your tongue until it bleeds and encourage the other person to comment. How do you do that? Ask questions. So what do you think about what I just said? Or what's your take on that? Or how do you respond? Ask them a question so that you can sit back and let them be engaged in the conversation. And you'll notice it is a conversation. Okay? It's important to get the other person to talk, because if they don't talk, then it's just you. It's a monologue, not a dialogue. You're just doing all the talking and they're just sitting there passively. You don't know whether they're taking it in or whatever. The chances are they're probably not. All right, so there's some key points to finish up with. Now, folks, homework. First of all, just before we wrap up, is there any questions, comments that anyone's got? Because now's your final chance, at least via this first broadcast. Okay. So your homework is this. I want you to give positive feedback 3 times a day for a week. So I'm giving you something relatively easy to do, but it's a habit-forming exercise. I want you to, this afternoon, we're starting this afternoon, this is not happening on Monday, this is starting this afternoon. I want you to give 3 positive bits of feedback. They don't have to be the same person, of course, but the important thing is that there are 3. So you go home tonight, the end of this week, you have given 3 bits of feedback. Now you might say, oh, I don't know where to start. Well, just watch and look and listen. There is plenty of things going on in your environment that you could be giving positive feedback on. It's probably that you just haven't looked. Now, by doing that, after 1 week, you will have given 15 bits of positive feedback. Now, I can assure you, as long as it's done positively and you keep in mind some of the things that we've talked about, I can assure you that that will make a big difference. Just doing that, just for a week. And then for the next week, you do the same. And this is just who you are. And it can only go for a couple of minutes. It's not a big deal. You don't have to sit people down with a coffee, on the run, in the corridor, wherever they might meet, over the photocopier, in the lunchroom, wherever it is, you can just give that feedback. Okay? So give it a go. I think you'll find it really very, very enlightening and interesting if you haven't already done that. So folks, as I said before early on, there are 5 more modules. Just to reiterate, what I need you to do is to make sure that you register for each one. So when you get this email from me, you'll get it tomorrow, but you may not open it until Monday. But whenever you do, make sure that you click on all the links and you register for all 5, so that you get these automated responses to remind you. And of course, you can put them in your calendar and everything else as well. You'll also receive a diagnostic to complete. So you'll receive that in your email as well. So it's really important that you complete that. You can print it off from your desktop, and you need to have that available for you when we meet again in a fortnight's time. And that's pretty much where we finish. So I'd like to wish you all a really happy new year. I hope 2019 is a cracker for you. I hope that you have a wonderful weekend, and I'm really looking forward to working with you throughout the rest of the Lunch and Learn series. So thank you, everyone, and I wish you all the very best. Thank you and goodbye.